Okay, welcome everybody to the October 15th Policy Committee meeting. Introductions wise, just want to say welcome to everybody. Welcome to our student representative, Rachel, Andrea, our teacher representative, Julia and Lydia as our committee members. Mr. Madden couldn't be here tonight. And we'll turn it over to Dr. Stevenson. Do you have any administrative remarks for us?
I don't.
No? Okay. So then let's go into public comment. Do we have any public comment this evening? Good evening, Dr. Winters.
Good evening, Roberta Winters, 326 Williams Road. I believe there is a policy here on bullying to be discussed tonight, and I recall when this was done several years ago, and I made the comment, and I will repeat the comment, that I believe bullying can be learned and can be modeled. And I think this policy belongs not only with students, but probably with other professional staff and others throughout the district, because I think we see it modeled in our society in many places, and I think it's something that we need to approach at all levels of our school district. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, let's see. Let's move into the approval of minutes. Does anybody have any corrections or comments on the minutes? No, no? I see no's. Okay. So, Lydia, you're looking at the minutes. Do you have any?
Oh, yeah, no, I'm good.
You're good?
I
Okay.
That's what happened.
Okay. All right, so Dr. Stevenson, we're good with the minutes, and we'll move into the first agenda item, Policy 719, Unmanned Aircraft Systems Drones.
Thank you. Policy 719, Unmanned Aircraft Systems Drones. This was brought before the full board for approval in the first read and in the September business meeting, and we're asking that because of no changes were made during that meeting, that we're recommending that this policy be brought for the full board at the October regular business meeting for a second read and final adoption.
So does anybody on the committee have any objection to it moving forward for a second read next week? We haven't made any changes since the first round? No? Okay, so let's move that forward, please.
I just have a question about the form.
Okay.
Small, I'm just curious. I noticed that they look like the form for district-owned and operated and non-district owned and operated are identical. And I noticed the one for district-owned and operated requires the user to ask, it says, has the drone been registered, and what's the registration number, and proof of the registration. How would that work? So like, say, for some reason I was eligible to use it, but it's school district owned and operated, I presume they'd already be registered, and do you know what I'm saying? It's not.
If it's school operated, the registration, those things would already be in file with the district, if it's a district. If it's outside, then they would have to bring those particular proofs with them.
So maybe you want to modify the
Yes.
form is all I'm saying.
Point well taken. Thank you.
Okay, great, thank you. Anybody else? No? Okay, so we're gonna move then that forward for a second read next week, and we will move into the second item on the agenda, which is Policy 233, Suspension and Expulsion, first read.
Policy 233, suspension and expulsion. This is related to the review that we did over the summer in connection to our district handbook. What I will I'll allow our solicitors to point out any particular items related that he think is need to be discussed about for this.
Thank you. The majority of the language that was in the previous policy is simply being moved to a regulation. That's the biggest change that the committee will see with this policy and administrative regulation.
Okay, so do you want it to, you ready for questions?
Sure.
Okay. Does anybody on the committee have questions about this policy? I'll start with Rachel.
I just have one general question. So, I'm looking at the red line version. A big portion of the body of the guidelines was taken out. Where was that moved to? Was that condensed into a smaller section of information?
So most of that language is in the administrative regulation, which is a couple pages further down in the packet. I believe that's where you'll find all of that.
Okay, so we just switched it to there.
Correct.
Gotcha, okay. That was my only question.
That's sort of what we've been, when we have these really long policies that include comprehensive guidelines. For the past couple of years, we've been moving them into an administrative regulation so that the policies are short.
Gotcha.
And the administrative regulations, the guidelines, which can be changed by the administration, are moved into an administrative regulation that doesn't have to go through the long policy review process.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Mhm.
Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Mrs. McMenamin, do you have any questions on the policy?
No.
Julia?
First, I have a question. I think you can answer this. I don't recall in the last 4 years, student expulsions. Has there been within the last 4 years? Can you answer that?
We have not had an expulsion in the last 2.5, I can say. I
Okay.
don't know previously.
And I'm only asking because I don't recall the process, and I was curious. And I just have some questions about the AR. I know that's not our thing, but if you don't mind. Let's see. By school officials. I was a little confused over, so you get an informal hearing if, can you walk me through that?
Sure. So anytime a student is suspended for up to and including 3 days, there's no hearing requirement. If a suspension exceeds 3 school days, a student's entitled to an informal hearing. Some people refer to that as a principal's hearing. That's a hearing that's held generally at the school building with the principal, and the student has an opportunity to sort of give their side of the story. Anytime there is a suspension that's proposed to exceed 10 days, 10 school days, anything more than 10 days under the law is considered a student expulsion. That's when the student's entitlement to a formal hearing comes into play. So 1 to 3 days, no hearing. 4 to 10 days, you get an informal hearing. And greater than 10 days, you get the informal hearing early on in the process, and then possibly a formal hearing at the end.
Okay. Okay, number 4, under the due process requirements, no retained attorneys will be permitted to participate in the hearing. Does that include the districts?
Correct, there's never attorneys at the informal hearings, correct.
That, I thought I saw somewhere they were talking about, sort of like in the case of an emergency, you can add 5 days?
5 days, you can go up to 15 days
For suspension.
when the underlying conduct constitutes a threat to the health, safety, or welfare of other students. So generally that exception is invoked if there's a weapon involved or severe physical altercation between students and the expulsion hearing hasn't yet happened.
I see, but it's going to happen. It's not, you don't get suspended for 15 days without an expulsion hearing.
Correct.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Okay, Lydia, do you have any questions? Okay, I have a few questions on the policy, and it falls within the authority section. So, the authority, the wording of authority says the board may, after a proper hearing, suspend a student for such time as it deems necessary or may permanently expel a student. I wasn't aware, I mean, again, there's so many different definitions coming at you with informal hearing, formal hearing, 3-day suspension. Does the board have the authority to suspend a student? I thought that that was limited to a school administrator. The board's authority is only as far as an expulsion goes. Is that true?
Correct. And the sentence under the authority that you just read, that is verbatim out of the State Board of Education regs, but we can tweak that a little bit to better reflect the actual process. So there's also language that could be inserted indicating that principals have the authority to suspend. So we can put that in the authority, and then we could have a second a second sentence that talks about the board's role in offering a formal hearing. So we can, Dr. Stevenson and I can tweak that language
Okay, I think that would be
prior
helpful.
to the next iteration.
Okay. And then the word proper, I looked onto the associated links and I see that that is also lifted straight from code. But proper, isn't anything that corresponds in terms of the other definitions of hearings. Like we have informal and we have formal, but which one applies to proper? So I just was wondering, is proper?
We can use the word appropriate.
Okay.
There's no problem with that. We can definitely do that.
Or the corresponding or whatever, something that sends us in the direction of either formal or informal. And then the other thing is that in that authority section, or maybe even as a separate definition section, I wasn't sure if the short-term, I was trying to get my head around the short-term suspension versus the long-term suspension. Is that something that would be helpful maybe to have as a definition, that the short-term suspension, there's so many different moving parts depending on which kind of suspension or action is underway? Do you think it's helpful to have short-term suspension, meaning up to 3 days, or long-term suspension, which means up to 10 days? Or is that something you have to go to the AR for? The AR has a lot of information in it, and hopefully nobody's too often in the boat of needing,
Right.
warranting a suspension or an expulsion, but I'm just thinking of parents going to that section, and how do we make it as clear as possible so that they understand what could potentially be happening to their child?
I don't know whether, certainly there's no right or wrong way to do it. Some districts do use temporary suspension and full suspension. But then there's confusion as to, well, what does a full suspension really mean? What is a short-term suspension? So I've sort of, the way this was written was to remove characterizing suspensions in any way other than the length of time. So you have a 1-day suspension, a 2-day suspension, a 6-day suspension, a 9-day suspension, and depending on how long the suspension is, that dictates the due process that you're entitled to.
Mm-hmm. So you don't think that would be helpful? You think it's better just to leave it the way it is once you add those other couple sentences in to clear up the board's authority? I mean, I
Right.
take your guidance on
Right.
that, yeah.
Yeah,
Okay,
yes.
all right. And is there, once this policy gets through, we just have, for this school year, our handbooks all set. Do the handbooks have to be immediately adjusted? One of the things that's great about that other school that does it the way they do, is that as soon as the policy is updated, because in the handbook, there's a live link to the policy, no one has to go back and rewrite that section of the handbook. It's just the new version of the policy is online, and the link is ready.
The good thing is, from a substantive standpoint, not a whole lot has changed. The procedure that would be followed for suspensions and expulsions hasn't changed.
Okay.
Because the due process that a student is entitled to, it's the same under the prior policy as it is under the proposed new policy.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the language has been moved around and it may be said a little bit differently, but I don't think that the handbook substantively will be out of compliance.
Okay,
Certainly, the next time they get reviewed, we can include the revised language, but I'm not concerned that they're substantively out of date.
okay. That's it for my questions. So I guess since I went last, unless anybody prompted a question for anybody else, we'll move that along for a first read next week as well, and get back to the next item on our agenda, which is the policy 113.1, discipline of students with disabilities, first read for repeal.
Correct. And that policy is being recommended for repeal. Maybe it would have been better to mention this when we were doing the suspension and expulsion, but we merged the contents of 113.1 into an attachment to 233. So all of the language about a process for suspending and expelling students with disabilities is included in that attachment B. And it's much more the proposed attachment to the regulation is much more detailed than what 113.1 was.
Yeah, the attachments are different fonts from each other, and they're different fonts from,
Oh,
so, just as a,
we can fix that.
okay. Does anybody have any questions about the repeal? No? Okay. All right, so aside from fonts, that looks like it's ready to move ahead for next week as well. And that brings us to the final policy on our agenda for tonight, which is 249 anti-bullying for a first read.
So this is one that's being reviewed. The school code requires every 3 years, the district look at the bullying policy and make any changes that it deems appropriate. So this was last looked at in November of 2016, so we're coming up on 3 years, so that's why that was put before the committee tonight. The definitions that are inserted for bullying and school setting, those come directly from the school code and the related regulations. The prior definitions weren't necessarily incorrect, but they didn't match exactly what was in the code. And we added an administrative regulation.
Okay, all right, so.
And I'll note that
Okay.
the administrative regulation addresses reporting procedures for how students and others can report allegations of bullying and the investigation procedures, and they were modeled off of the anti-hazing policy. So the same procedures that a student would follow if they felt they needed to report hazing, it's the identical process for bullying.
Okay,
And that makes sense, because a lot of times, whether it's bullying or harassment or hazing, a lot of times there's overlap in that conduct anyway. So to have one consistent procedure is generally desirable.
yep, makes perfect sense. All right, Rachel, do you have any, no? Mrs. McMenamin?
Just a small typo on the back page. Employees who fail to report known instances instead of instanced,
In the policy,
the AR.
they are.
Anything else?
That's all.
Lydia?
So, one of the things in the original policy states, this policy is limited to bullying of students by other students. Allegations of bullying by employees or other adults are covered by the policies cross-referenced at the end of this policy. So they have taken that out. And now in the definition of bullying, it doesn't really speak to that we're talking about students to other students. So are we now broadening that to kind of mean anybody in the school setting? Why did they take that piece out?
Well, there are still unlawful harassment policies that generally would apply to staff. Generally, when bullying is mentioned, I think the understanding is that that's between students. That's not to say that adults can't be bullies, as we might understand that term, but generally bullying behavior, when it involves adults, generally falls under the unlawful harassment policies.
So why did they take that out? So the intention is the same, that this is student to student
Correct. Yeah,
behavior.
and those policies regarding unlawful harassment, they're still in place. But whether they need to be cross-referenced in a student bullying policy, I think that was where we kind of thought maybe not. We can leave, the references can stay if
I kind of like that in there, because to me then it sounds, it's really not that clear who we're talking about, who's bullying who. Like, is it one teacher bullying another teacher? Like, I kind of like it up front saying, this is with regard to student
Okay.
behavior.
Okay.
How does everybody else feel about that? Does anybody? Because, I mean, it does say in the purpose, therefore, the board prohibits bullying by and of district students. That, the sentence you're talking about, I think maybe further clarifies that, but there is some reference to the fact that it has to do with students in the purpose.
Right, because again, even that doesn't say who's doing the bullying. It's so, I think it should be delineated. Because I was confused when I'm reading this. I'm like, well, does this pertain to administrators? Like, what?
Should
Without
it
that.
pertain to administrators? Should it pertain
No.
to student on teacher? Should it pertain to student on a non-student?
No. Well,
I'd ask
Right,
the
it's,
lawyer.
yeah, it's, I mean, a student bullying policy is generally student-on-student conduct.
What happens if a student feels an adult is bullying them? Where is that covered?
Probably the maintaining appropriate boundaries policy
I don't think we have that,
in the 800 series.
do we? Because I mean, I've heard on occasion throughout the years, a student feeling like they're being bullied by an adult, so how was that addressed?
And what happens is that's then handled as a personnel matter and is investigated. And if it's, deemed to be, what could be harassing behavior, then there are consequences to that.
What if it's not personnel? What if it's a parent?
So what if a parent, we feel, is bullying a teacher, or
Student.
a parent is bullying a student? Is the parent in our school doing it?
Yes. Well,
What
you
role
say
is the parent
cyber,
playing?
you cover cyberbullying, so
Right.
if it's a parent of a student,
So so if a parent, so again, that's where the law comes in. So if we have a tip that a parent is doing something that could be bullying to a student, we would contact the authorities and the police would investigate.
so this covers what the law does not.
So this is under the 200 pupil section. So that's, first off, a clear indication that this is students. It's under the pupil section of our policy. And this is about responding to what have been, regulations and laws that have been created about bullying within schools. And so that's why it's specific to, student-to-student bullying.
Okay.
So I guess if there were a student who was being bullied perhaps by a non-student, but a member of the school district community, the redress for that would be to report it to
Report it to any adult.
any adult?
Any adult, and it would be investigated, would be looked into.
I'm wondering if is that just supposed to be common sense? Would it be, if there's a caveat sentence like Lydia is saying, where this only pertains to student on student, just throwing it out there hypothetically speaking, does it make sense to take that maybe one step further and just say if student is experiencing it from an adult, report to blah, 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 and there's no policy, but it just sort of clears up that.
I think the statement before listed the cross-reference, so the statement that was in there,
Yeah.
we
So
could still
Lydia
put, we
puts
could
that
still, we could still have that statement.
Yeah, I
mean,
like
if Ed's
that
comfortable, that
back
statement
in
could still be
there.
in there. And then it lists the cross-references of policy 233 and policy 218.
Yeah.
But certainly, we could put language like that.
One of the other things I mentioned to Dr. Stevenson, one of the other things that I mentioned to Dr. Stevenson that we could consider, a lot of times, school districts will have a civility policy, and that would apply to parents, guardians, volunteers, visitors in our school, and it essentially would state that when you're in our school, there's rules, you have to be conducting yourself appropriately, lay out some ground rules, and if you're not acting in accordance with those guidelines, we reserve the right to tell you to leave or refer your conduct to the police or to the appropriate authorities. So that could be something that we consider as a future policy adoption.
Yeah, I know Lower Merion has that. Is that one of the ones you were thinking of?
Yeah, a lot of school districts have
And
it,
we're
and
having
it
it now.
addresses when parents become disruptive in meetings or times when I've seen.
Sports?
Yeah, I've seen it used, at extracurricular activities and sports. Sometimes if you know, we've seen in the past where parents will actually get on a bus and start yelling at another student. So any of those types of scenarios where somebody's acting in a way we wouldn't want them to, this policy would just give us the authority to tell that person to stop and have a policy to point to.
Yeah, that might be the catch-all that sort of makes sure that no matter where it's coming from or going to, it's, people are protected, because bullying is not a minor problem in life, unfortunately. So
One of the other things that Susan and I had spoken about before the meeting was possibly considering adding to the definition of school setting any location where the school has jurisdiction over a student's conduct. And an example was if a student is using a district laptop off campus and they're doing something that is violating our policies, we do have the ability to discipline for that because they're using district property. So there was a thought about adding to the definition of school setting other areas where the school has jurisdiction.
I don't know how the rest of the committee feels, but I think especially as districts move to asynchronous learning and more cyber learning goes on, maybe that's something that we need to have to cover. I mean, we do have a one-to-one program in our district, so does anybody have any objection to including that?
No,
Anyone knows?
I agree with putting that in. And putting back, I don't know if we resolved putting back in the
legal
definition
Yeah,
of it and the
we'll-
cross-references and make it all more explicit and tighten it up.
Yep.
So I had another couple questions. One is that in the definition, bullying, in the second sentence, it says that is severe, persistent, or pervasive. And I was wondering, does that conflict with the third paragraph under guidelines where it says acts of bullying vary in nature and severity? As such, the totality of all surrounding circumstances must be considered in making the determination whether, and I was wondering if the insertion of the word severe bullying has occurred, because that's the only kind that's actionable, is whatever's deemed to be severe, right? And I thought that it might make it more consistent and clear if we tie in the definition of bullying that is gonna be attended to as severe to the third paragraph in guidelines. What do you think about that? Because it's very clear in the definition of bullying that severe bullying is the type that's going to be subject to these consequences. But then there's a more ambiguous statement, I think, in that third sentence saying sometimes it's severe, sometimes it's not. We have to figure out what it is.
Well,
I take exception to that. I think that it actually says severe, persistent, or pervasive. So in other words, it could be an act that you wouldn't in and of itself consider severe, but if it happens every single day,
Okay.
that it's pervasive, then that is bullying. And if somebody just told you that happened, like, oh, that person, said something under their breath, but then it happened for 3 weeks in a row, then that, even though not severe, is pervasive. So, no, I disagree with that interpretation, I think.
Anybody else have any thoughts on that? No, you look, Mrs. McManaman looks like she's got some thoughts.
So along those same lines, in the definition, it says intentional electronic, written, verbal, or physical act or series of acts. So if bullying is supposed to take place over time, what defines one act as bullying?
Well, the severity, but not,
correct.
so it could be something not severe that's pervasive or something extremely severe that happened once, as I see it. I mean,
And I think that's why the third paragraph under the guidelines is there, is because if you have an event that is so severe, you can consider that bullying, even though most times bullying is a pattern of behavior. It's rare that you have just a single incident that constitutes bullying. but it can be.
What do you think, Mrs. McMenamin?
I guess I vote that.
Okay. And then this is a more global question about jurisdiction and helping to better understand where school district jurisdiction begins and ends. Let's say that a student is at home and there's some cyberbullying going on among students that isn't taking place on school property, meaning with the school-issued computer. And it's not happening during the school day, but it happened at home, and the bullying occurred there, and there are ramifications for it back at school. Is that something that falls within this policy to be remedied, or is that strictly referred to law enforcement, or what are the dividing lines between law enforcement jurisdiction and school district jurisdiction?
So school districts have the ability to discipline for conduct that takes place off of school property to the extent that in a couple scenarios. One, where there's harm threatened to a student or a staff member or to district property.
Any kind of harm, like emotional harm, physical harm?
Yeah, if you can allege a case that harm is threatened against a student, yes, you can take action. A second scenario would be where the conduct outside of school has implications in school. So kids are exchanging threatening text messages or social media posts outside of school, and then they come into school and they're showing all their friends the posts or forwarding them amongst one another. Because the outside conduct has now caused some sort of disruption or has impacted the school day, you can discipline for that. It can also be, you can also discipline where administration has a reasonable belief that conduct that took place outside of school will impact. So you don't actually have to wait for a disruption to happen. If the district became aware of student conduct that was taking place away from school property, and there was a reasonable belief that as a result, come Monday morning, there's going to be a disruption at school, you can intervene and you can discipline for that conduct.
Okay, and so that would then call into play 249? Or
Well-
where would the,
So by adding to the definition of school setting, any location where the school has jurisdiction, we have jurisdiction over all of those scenarios that I just mentioned. So we would be able to act under this policy. But it doesn't just go for bullying. It can be weapons, it can be drugs, it can be harassment, it can be hazing, any of those policies that deal with student behavior. Anytime any of those criteria that I laid out are met, the school district has the ability to discipline for.
okay. Okay, so then what would not fall under a school district jurisdiction
Things that don't have
in terms of bullying?
any impact at school. So two students are teasing one another at home, and there's no impact at school. Nobody's talking about it. Maybe they don't even go to the same school. Maybe it's two students from two different elementary schools. So we have to either show that there was a disruption at school, an impact at school, or a likely impact.
Okay, that's really clear. Okay.
Does impact include, though, if it's contained to the student? So if I'm saying terrible things about you at home and you go into school and you're really, really sad, but you're not disrupting it, we really have no jurisdiction over that.
That is an interesting question. That's probably a little bit of a gray area as to how far you can go. So we have an obligation to maintain a school environment that's not discriminatory, that is safe, and all of those things. So if it's a legitimate, if a student is not able to access their educational program because of something that's taking place outside of school, I would say that my opinion would be you can discipline and intervene for that.
Because it's disruptive of
Mhm.
the education.
Correct.
Okay.
And, these are the kinds of questions I think that parents think of and can relate to. And if we use the term jurisdiction, is it reasonable to think that maybe it could be expounded upon in a handbook or something like that, so that if a parent, I mean, we're using these policies not just to inform how the district addresses things, right? It's also meant to inform parents and students about what the essence of this issue is and how it's addressed, et cetera. But jurisdiction is not a really clear term. I mean, it took you a while to explain it to me,
Right.
and then Julia had a follow-up question. Is there any place to flesh out jurisdiction, either in a handbook or somewhere else?
Yeah, and I think one of the things that will be coming in future months is the actual policy 218 on discipline, and there will be a section in that policy on when the district, and in situations where the district does have jurisdiction, because again, it doesn't, the question of jurisdiction is not just applicable to a bullying policy.
Right.
It's applicable to all the student discipline policies. So I think really where it probably belongs is in policy 218, because it addresses the district's ability to discipline for any type of offense. So that would be in 218, which is actively being reviewed. We're
Right.
working on that now.
Okay, and maybe there at some point, I don't know if it's in here or not, I didn't check. Oh, there is a cross-reference to 218 here.
Right.
Okay, that makes sense. And then the other, I had a question on the AR, two questions. One was in number 2, where it says, below is a non-exhaustive list of examples of possible bullying behavior. I'm sorry, number 1, intimidating, threatening, demeaning letters, notes, messages, or emails. And I was wondering if, in this day and age, something like texts, postings, certainly not up with the most
Sure.
current terminology, but it seemed to me like this left off a little bit before 2019.
We can add
Who writes a
those.
letter anymore, right? Right, I don't know, Rachel, what do you think as the student? Text, postings, is that how these would be conveyed? What do you think?
I would go broader with maybe social media
Yeah,
usage.
I think that's
something
great.
like that.
You can add, we can add social media.
Just 'cause
Yeah.
maybe post is a little narrow.
Right.
Depending on how you're using it. Those are my thoughts.
Tweet,
Sure.
right? So I'm
There you go.
Thank you.
Catching on.
That's why it's so good to have a student on the panel, because I don't know what I'm talking
Could say
about.
digital media.
Social
Something,
media.
yeah, to expand it to
Yeah, I think
that
that's definitely worth including.
domain.
But we need to have social media something. It needs to be we need a noun. So a social media post or social media missive or
Vacations.
communication? Thank you.
Digital communication, is that what you landed on? Okay.
No, social media communication, right?
Guess so. Whatever, whoever knows this better than I do says, I'm good with that. And then this was interesting to me, under publicity, the third thing says, building administrators or their designees will ensure that this administrative regulation and the accompanying board policy are available in all classrooms and posted in a prominent location in each school building. Do we really do that?
That's a very, very old requirement in the school code. That language is still there. So the way I interpret that is, as long as the electronic policy manual is accessible in the classrooms, which it is, because there's computers everywhere in our schools, that requirement is met. Technically, wherever the postings are in the school, bulletin board or something like that, there should be something that this policy should be posted, but it's not it's not enforced, but it is language in the school code. And so, given that this policy gets submitted to PDE for review periodically, so that's why it's in there.
But so they say you need to have the electronic website available, but that you also do need to post. I mean, they say both.
Right, correct.
And I'm sorry, I had the fourth paragraph of the policy under guidelines. This is one thing I forgot to bring up earlier. But it says the superintendent or designee may develop and may provide district employees. I get it that shall is usually used when there's a law requiring it to be so, but I just wanted to double check, because in this, it's hard to believe there isn't, in this day and age, a law that requires school districts to have anti-bullying programming and to provide employees and students with appropriate training. So I was just wondering if those mays are right to be mays as opposed to shalls.
Where are you?
There's no requirement that any of
Oh,
these
No, shall.
programs be offered. A lot of times, the way I've seen it is it's in connection with other types of training, so child abuse training is not a good example, but a lot of times there are mandated trainings that incorporate bullying prevention awareness, because again, there's generally a lot of overlap between bullying behavior and other non-permitted behavior.
Okay, and it doesn't conflict with number 3 under delegation of responsibility, where the superintendent or designee shall annually provide these 3 different pieces of information, the third of which is information on the development and implementation of any bullying prevention, intervention, or education programs.
Correct.
So there's no conflict there, because if you're not doing any of that, you just say nothing.
Correct.
Okay, all right. Well, those were my questions. Does that prompt any other questions, concerns?
Yeah,
Leah?
just a legal question. So this is required in state law to be reviewed every 3 years?
Yes.
Huh, okay. Are there other policies that it's written in we have to review at a certain?
The student wellness
Yeah.
policy is a new one from a couple years back.
Okay.
The first 3-year cycle is probably about to come up in another year or so.
So it's 3 years also?
Correct.
Yeah, okay.
Yep.
Okay. Got your job written in the
Yeah.
state law, good for you.
Okay, so with that, that concludes all the policies we're talking about tonight. So that one will go for a first read. Is that nothing was substantive, or, I mean, well, we can change it, it's only a first read, so even if it was, I don't think we have to bring it back, right? Anything that we talked about?
I think we can move the bullying forward, because those changes, I think we all had a good understanding as to what needed to be changed. Regarding suspension and expulsion, there were a lot of changes where we said that Anthony and I would discuss, where we don't have completely solidified language yet. So we can either put that forward based on our high-level discussion, and it would come back next month, or we can hold it and just bring it back to the committee.
I don't know
first.
how
Either
everybody else
way.
feels, but I think you guys have a pretty good grasp on what it is, and there's still a second read.
Right.
So it could be tweaked in the second read without being substantively changed, which wouldn't slow down the process. Does anybody have an objection? And I think it can move on, don't you? Okay.
Okay.
All right, so we'll have then, let's see, 4 things on next week's agenda, 3 things for a first read and 1 thing for a second read. Okay, so that brings us to new business. Is there any new business? What is this?
I brought it down. I closed the screen.
Is this the new business?
No.
Oh, okay.
No.
I saw some neat geographic boxes there. Okay, and then that is public comment, and I don't think there's anybody here to make public comment. So with that, we'll call the meeting to a close. Thank you, everybody.